together we can. And that's the whole objective over these 24 hours. It's to see what we can do in terms of financial donations, in terms of intellectual donations, in terms of contributing to support people who desperately need our help. So be generous, help us wherever you can. But it's also about learning as much as we can. And as Pierre was saying, disasters are around us everywhere. We see them. I know I really became aware of them, I think, with the tsunami on the Boxing Day here in Australia's backyard, Indonesia, a lot of the countries around us really affected, and the visual images of that shocked the world. And since then, we've had multiple occasions: the war in the Ukraine, what's happening now in Syria and Turkey. Here in Australia, we've also had quite a few disasters. In Sydney in the last few years, or in New South Wales in the last few years in particular, we've had floods, we've had bushfires, more floods, even more floods. And our first speaker today is Sarah Foxe, who was commissioned to head up the PMO for Resilience New South Wales, an organisation set up to deal with primarily the bushfires and then the flood disasters. And that role has been expanded a little bit further now. So we're going to hear from Sarah, who is going to talk to us about the role of a PMO disaster. And we'll take us through some of the activities that the PMO for Resilience New South Wales had to go through. Sarah will also be around in our panel discussion afterwards to talk a little bit more about some of the implications of how we can try and support organizations bringing relief efforts into the environment, or into these disaster areas. So I first met Sarah, I think it was last year, at a similar conference, and then have had her speak at a number of functions before. The experiences that she's gone through and what we've gone through as people in New South Wales has been quite amazing. I'm sure you're going to find it extremely interesting listening to her. So please join me in welcoming Sarah with the role of a PMO in a disaster. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And before I begin, I just like to acknowledge I'm on the ancestral lands of the Daryl people. I acknowledge the first Australians as the traditional custodians of the continent, whose cultures are amongst the oldest living cultures in human history. So look, before I get into the presentation on how we established a PMO in the height of multiple disasters over the last 12 months and the role that the PMO took in the organisation, which was Resilience at the time, I'm going to throw to you for a brief check-in. I'm thinking that maybe some of you have been listening online since early this morning, or maybe it's late in your time zone right now. I know I joined late last night and had listened to many of the presentations. I'd like you just, have a look. What dog can you identify with today? How have you shown up today for this presentation? And what resonates with you the most? And while you're thinking about that, I'll just share that I'm actually feeling like I'm ready to ship, especially after listening to many of the presentations last night. I'm excited to hear about all the work that you're doing around the world. And definitely we'll be reaching out to learn more, as I think there are many opportunities for mutual learning as we're all adjusting quite rapidly to the challenges that climate change is bringing, and the flux and the change in the seasons that we're not used to or not prepared for. So I hope you've, identified the dog that you empathise with the most. And the reason I guess I've brought in this a little bit of an icebreaker before we launch into the presentation is this was one of the tools that we used when working in a rapid and chaotic environment of last year. Having a brief check-in just helps create empathy and understanding amongst the team. People show up in different spaces, and everyone also has personal lives that they're juggling in those really stressful times too. And that was just a really useful tool that we used when we're working quite rapidly in those stressful times. So now I'll just brief you on the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. I'm so sorry, my battery's about to run out on the computer. I'm just going to plug it in. just going to do that before we have any significant glitches. Apologies. So, look, many of you may have heard about Resilience New South Wales. That was set up after the 2019-2020 bushfires that saw the loss of over 2,400 homes and the devastation of 5.4 million hectares or 13 million acres of bushland. From the learnings out of that event, resilience was established. And before that, there was the Office of Emergency Management. We've had a similar situation occur where we had a massive flood event last year in March 2022, and significant floods actually throughout the whole year in New South Wales. And from a flood review and an inquiry, has actually led to another new agency called the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. This agency was formed in December last year, and our focus is on disaster prevention, preparedness, recovery, reconstruction, and adaptation to the effects of natural disasters in New South Wales. This new entity has greater powers in planning reform, just to really help support critical decisions around building back and future proofing our state. So this slide is for some of those out there who love some good facts on a page, and is really the rationale behind why the Reconstruction Authority exists and why we are supporting, and coordinating a government response to disasters across the other state government agencies. The top line in this PowerPoint shows the number of natural disaster declarations made in a financial year. And the second line shows how many local government areas that have been declared in New South Wales as impacted by a natural disaster. And so probably only for those who are online from New South Wales, you may be aware that there's only 128 LGAs, local government areas in New South Wales. And you can see from the second line there that we've had, numbers up around 170 declarations for local government areas in a year. So many local government areas have been hit multiple times by disasters. And you can just see that the significant the scale of that, and with multiple LGAs impacted, it has a significant impact on social and economic outcomes for those areas. So for those of you who prefer more of a visual map, here is one. Here's a bit of a heat map. This is a snapshot over the last 3 years from July 2019 to current, which was last week. And you can see here by the colours on this map that 100% of the state has at one point in time been declared a natural disaster over the last 3 years. And you can see that in some of the areas that are the deep purple impacts, they've been impacted multiple times. We've got one LGA that has been declared a natural disaster, Wingecarribee, 12 times over the last 3 years. So now I've set the scene on, I guess, the context and the importance for us as an agency in supporting the community, supporting the response to disasters, but also helping prepare. I'll touch on the context of the role of the PMO. So prior to 2021 and the onboarding of new staff with the formation of Resilience New South Wales, the PMO was set up to be a PMO, but because of the frequency of natural disasters and the frequency of staff needing to be mobilised and operational, the PMO didn't actually eventuate. The PMO was kind of stuck in a bit of an organisational reporting function. Given the skill sets of a PMO, it's often stakeholder collaboration and data and reporting and insights. Those skill sets were drawn upon and just mobilised into responding to the disasters and using those skills, and that PMO team didn't actually set up and establish as a PMO. Because of the findings, I guess, of the bushfires and the establishment of Resilience New South Wales, there was real drive and support to set up an enterprise PMO to look at that more that long-term kind of project implementation, and around how do we make decisions as well when crisis hits, and how do we stop, start, put on projects on hold, or accelerate projects that are needed, including, bringing that change management discipline, the risk management's benefits and lessons learned as well are really vital. So to really establish the PMO, this was 2 years ago when I joined. It was really important to get that organisational support and to shift away from the work that we were doing, which was more reactionary, to a more purpose and outcomes focused and enterprise-wide PMO. So to do this, I needed to gain, the buy-in from the senior leadership team, which were also very new to the agency, and they all had invested interest in setting the PMO up for success. So here, we had some agreements on our role and purpose and function, and it helped that we had some external evaluations as well to really support the establishment of it, and we were able to get this mandate set up and supported and implemented. So a little bit of our journey with the establishment of the PMO, and this was before the significant flood event in March. So what we did initially was we just took stock. The previous agency had picked up and dropped so many projects on a regular basis to respond to disasters. So we needed to understand what we had on our books essentially, and this was probably the most important exercise that we did as an agency, is really just a bit of a project stock take, and getting clarification and decisions around ownership of projects and outcomes, and did those outcomes still align with the needs of the state at the time. We really did that alignment piece on being really clear about who we were and what services we provided the agency, and what our value add was as a PMO. And then we set up effective, decision making at the executive level and also at the director level, and to ensure that the agency was across those critical project decisions. We supported also in really practical ways. I think, when you're setting up a PMO, sometimes I guess the temptation is to focus on tools and templates and project methodology and getting everything in place that people can use. But we really kind of put some of that work on hold while we jumped in and helped projects that were in need. So we helped them. Some projects needed Agile methodology for quick implementation. So we were able to jump in and help them with scoping, planning, and then delivering those Agile projects. That actually really helped us develop that buy-in from the agency, in terms of the skill set of the PMO and how we could support. And some of these teams were working operationally as well, so they had some exposure to the experience and also to the skills before the March floods hit. So we also identified a significant piece of work that we're holding on to, that needed to transition, and so we supported that across the agency kind of over a 6-month period. Then, phase two, we looked at developing templates and tools and resources, and we created really the awareness and desire for project governance. We took, we held like open sessions with the organisation called Ask Me Anything, to kind of demystify, some of the I guess the feelings and previous experiences staff may have had with project management officers. We didn't want to be seen as a police or governing body, but we really wanted to be positioning ourselves as an enabling function. And I think from our learnings is that when you set a project up for success, it's a lot about the culture and how people work and how they collaborate together. So having an Ask Me Anything session, we were able to explore with 100 staff in the agency, what positive experiences they had from projects, and what were some of the behaviours and the cultures that they saw in those project teams. So we really wanted to start from there rather than start from the framework and the tools and templates. Another tool that we would use in the setup was really thinking through what problems were we trying to solve, and understanding the approach that we have solved those problems. And I jumped online last night, and there was a few there was a few sessions that touched on the Cynefin model from Snowden and Boone. This is a fantastic tool, and I use it a lot when we're working through business problems that we're trying to solve, and even solutions that we're looking to put in place. This model was really helpful to understand the approach that you take with the team, and so I'll just talk through it briefly. You've got the 4 different quadrants there, and the kind of quadrant on the ordered side is the obvious and the complicated pieces of work. And with those pieces of work, especially with the obvious, it's good practice. You just get it done. So you don't need a level of coordination or collaboration. You just know what's best practice. You need to get on and implement it. With the coordination side, where it's a bit complicated, it maybe sits across a few different teams and impacts people, usually can take a best practice approach. So you understand the problem, you analyze it, and then you respond. And then moving across to the unordered kind of um, spheres, you've got complex and you've got chaotic. And in the complex space, you usually probe, sense, and respond. And there's a fair amount of iteration as you go through that. There's a high amount of collaboration, and that's really that emergent practice. And I think Agile really works in that space quite well. And then you've got the chaotic sphere down the bottom, which is novel practice. And often you just need to act, sense, and respond, and have a bit of a reflection. Did you take the right actions in the first place? So this quadrant was really important for us because we use this in all of our responses, and it came in quite handy when we hit the March floods. But in setting up some of the governance and the tools, we actually used a complex approach from the collaboration perspective. We took the time to actually build and engage people from the organization's input into designing some of the templates and the tools. And we interviewed also over 20 stakeholders in terms of what were the project needs across the agency. And we used human-centered design questions to ask them questions like, what makes you feel confident about decisions, and can you give us an example where you haven't felt confident, and what was the situation around that, which has really helped us establish and increase ownership and buy-in in the PMO. So this is one of the tools that we used as well. You might be familiar with test and learn. This was a test and learn approach that we took on a change and comms template we were developing. And if we rolled this out just in a mass effort without this collaboration, we would have had significant pushback from the agency, because taking this approach, we were able to get people's feedback on what worked well, what needs to change, what are the behavioural changes we need to consider before rolling any kind of change management kind of approaches out in the agency. And then it increased that buy-in. So when we were able to roll it out, it actually landed really well, and it's a template that's still used today. So the journey, taking a little bit back to the journey, and I think we felt like we had a 5 months run to kind of set up the PMO, and we're doing reasonably well. And we were about to launch significant changes to risk management and project status reporting when the floods hit. So the floods hit in 2022, and I'll just share some facts about the New South Wales floods. So you're familiar, I guess, with the scale of the impact, and they're floods like we've never seen before. So by the end of the first week in March last year in southern Queensland and northern New South Wales, we had received more than a year's worth of rainfall in 1 week. Then we had another low pressure system brought in by heavy rains to the east coast that forced thousands to flee from their homes for the second time within weeks. And then we'll hit again on the 7th of April in Sydney. We received a month's worth of rain overnight. So by the time the first 3 months had passed in Sydney, we had already received more than a year's worth of rainfall in the first quarter of the year. So the March floods were the costliest floods in our history in Australia ever, and the 5th most costly after the Easter Sydney hailstorm in 1999 and Cyclone Tracy in 1974. And the Newcastle earthquake as well. The event is estimated to have cost us up to $4 billion in insured losses. there have been a significant number of homes that were uninhabitable, and that's 4,000, over 4,000. And this has led to, I guess, our most complex challenge. Even now, we're looking at, the housing crisis, and there's lots of the challenges in the housing environment in Australia, with rental costs being quite high and household affordability being out of reach for many. So we're working, with communities that were already quite disadvantaged, and there was already significant homelessness in many of the communities where this occurred. So you might remember hearing on the news from the community that no one respected this, and the levels were significantly higher than they had ever been before. And I guess just to give you some context, and you can see from the picture here, water levels actually reached ceilings of over 1,600 homes. So they were above the ceilings of homes, which was just so significant. So I've got some more facts here just to compare and to, I guess, demonstrate it was like a disaster that we haven't seen before. We had calls for help. They were 4 times higher from the bushfires, which were really significant in Sydney. So we had over, 200,000 calls for help compared to for 47,000 with the bushfires, and we had over 1,500 homes destroyed in that process with the floods. But I guess looking at these statistics over the last three, significant and four events, we had more floods in July last year and September. When you combine all these, events for the state, over 9,000 homes have been destroyed, and a total of, $10 billion in support has been provided so far. It is a significant problem, and we need to look at, how do we do more, I guess, in that prevention and that mitigation and adaptation space to prepare for the future. So now I'll talk a little bit about the role of the PMO and the State Emergency Operations Centre. And so this is a picture of the State Emergency Operations Centre in New South Wales. It is the centre where this centre is activated and stood up in times of significant disaster. It's essentially the central hub where emergency services agencies can monitor and coordinate in real time the whole of government response. We found, all of a sudden, when the floods hit, we were working out of this central hub. And, I guess we walked past the CEOC in its dormant state. We were aware of its existence, but I guess nothing could prepare us and the team for seeing this in action. And I think personally, it was probably as close of experience as I would get to working at NASA than I'd ever get. It is, a fantastic way to work, I guess, and coordinate across the state government actors. And it was really great to see that collaboration and that work and that coordination happening in person. And so when the PMO moved across and started working from the CEOC on a daily basis for a period of 21 days, we had 8 hours to get a critical status set up from the state across agencies to inform a daily report that was going to National Cabinet and the Premier and all government agencies. We were quite new to this context. Honestly, we had no idea to start. There were only a handful of us that had emergency experience, but we had, our project management experience and diverse, international development, disaster management experience that we brought to the table. So what we did, we really just jumped into it. We leapt into the chaotic quadrant. We just jumped into ACT, okay, understanding who the key actors were, and to pull some of that critical information across the state. And we were able to produce a daily report for the first 3 weeks, and life was a bit of a blur. Now, everything was quite manual at that point, and because with our PMO hat on, we were already looking at how do we move this into an online report and dashboard that is available. So in that time, as we were producing the report, we were also working on what that future state needed to be. And this is where the disaster recovery dashboard was born. We worked with the spatial services team in the Department of Customer Community Service, and they were fantastic. They had nicknames for the satellites. They were an incredible team that had access to some really powerful data, and we worked with them to set up the New South Wales statewide recovery dashboard. And our role in this was really coordinating across all the different agencies, ensuring data points were going in. We had over 37 data providers across the state and 100 data sets, and worked across over 20 functional areas, including health, police, education, welfare and transport, and ADF. And all of this we were able to do quite rapidly, and the disaster recovery dashboard is still in use today. We've actually been able to pivot it even further we now have a Power BI kind of platform model where agencies can actually look at the information and drill down to that information more readily. So once we worked through that and we set up, essentially that dashboard or role, our critical role was that piece. We also needed to bring back to the agency in that about 3-week period. We set up a meeting to discuss our projects, what was happening with the projects, do we take them off hold, what projects continue, and what projects do we need to actually remove resources and dedicate them to the recovery efforts. So we were able to set up a meeting with our chair and the ELT to have some quick decisions around that, which was the first time the agency was able to do that. And I think it was really important to free up staff and also to focus efforts on some projects that really needed to keep going despite the chaotic environment and the recovery efforts. So after that, we got back to our work as a PMO. I think it was a bit of a shock for us. We also needed to regroup as a team and look at staffing and resourcing, because we did lose some staff after the floods. As a PMO, it was quite an intense experience, and I think many of you would probably appreciate the intense working environment that can happen. And so to return to our PMO work was just a bit of a balancing act, especially with more floods coming and more events that were happening over the year. And so we continued, I guess, to build awareness of the framework and tools. We didn't push so much any new pieces of work, but we supported some of those projects into regrouping and reforming. And so this is just one of the templates we use to do that. It's a North Star template. And for some initiatives that weren't formal projects, we supported the organisation using this template to help people clarify, the purpose and the scope and why should we be doing this now. And there was another template as well that we use, the expectations map. And this is a human-centered design tool. This one was actually really important, especially if staff were kind of influx, to regroup and think about, the project and what outcomes we wanted to deliver and how we were hoping to, think and feel in 6 months' time, what things we were hoping to see or be saying and doing or hearing because of the impact of that project. So it really just helped align people around those outcomes again and have those, a shared vision and shared goal to get on with delivery. So I've done a lot of talking. I think it's time for some questions. But look, finally, I just want to just shout out. There's some fantastic resources in New South Wales that the Red Cross have prepared about preparing communities, and one of those pieces is just getting to know your neighbours, and probably just an encouragement to you all as we're all facing, increased instability with the climate and disasters in future. Is knowing your neighbours is really important, and having that connection, because those community connections and those neighbour connections are really important when things happen. And yeah, so I guess that's just an encouragement to you all to have a think about that. Do you know your neighbours, and do you have are you prepared? Are you prepared, and you know what to do if a disaster will hit? So thank you so much for your time today. I will now go to Q&A. It's your opportunity to ask any questions.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for an informative presentation. And I'll be honest, every time I hear you,
I think we're just waiting for Jürgen to pop up on stage.
Yep. Can you? Can you hear me now?
So as we're waiting for Jürgen to join, I might just one of the questions I was given previously was about that staff and how to prepare staff for this. I think knowing what we know now and knowing the volatile environment, I think it's really important to prepare staff as they come into a project management office if you're working in this environment, and get them across, I guess, the complexity and what some of their roles might be in the organisation to help if the organisation surges or needs to respond rapidly. So I'd start there, and also just making sure there's appropriate training in place for staff, that they are aware of what that operational environment looks like. Just having that awareness and understanding of roles and responsibilities is empowering for the team, and can ensure, I guess, longevity for the team and for staff.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. You've just popped up.
Great, thank you. So every time I listen to you, I see new facts, new data. The situation seems to be getting worse as well, with the number of LGAs affected. And I know we were talking the other day about the amount of rain that we're having right now, and the paradox of the risk coming up now is one for fire. So it's an amazing country, this constant challenge of going from one extreme to another. And it's an element that we'll be exploring a little bit later on in the panel. We had a question from Michelle saying, you talked about the Carnarvon model and how you've used it for sense making. Did you also use it to actually find solutions? You touched a little bit on design thinking on this. So
Yeah.
could you just elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, so look, with the Kinevin model, I think really in that collaboration space, in that quadrant where it's complex. I really think that's where design thinking comes in, and I've used human-centered design and design thinking approaches to identify, really unpack what the problem is, and then in that discovery phase, and then really synthesizing that down and getting agreements. This is the problem we're trying to solve. And then from there, you can, we've used design thinking to ideate and work with some of, our customers or end users on, okay, what is the appropriate solution to this problem? And then using Agile in the implementation, it's a bit of test and learn. Did we get it right? We thought this was the solution, but does this solution hit the mark? And often in the implementation of test and learn, if you are using Agile and design thinking, it can really, in that implementation phase, it can really help you hone in what is the right outcome for the organization. And that takes time. So in the complex project quadrant, you actually really need to have the headspace and the time to do design thinking. And it can really be quite powerful when you come up with solutions for that. And and I think those alternative solutions are really fascinating. If you do take the approach, it will be really clear at the end. Oh, that was really easy. Why didn't we think about that in the first place? But you don't often land on that unless you go through that design thinking process, which it's the double diamond model. So I think Kinevin kind of is quite powerful, coupled with understanding of design thinking and then Agile for implementation.
Thank you. I would invite you, if you have further questions, to please pop them into the chat, and they'll come up. There are a couple coming in. Sarah, one I just wanted to touch on. You mentioned it takes time, and you need to be in the right headspace. Now, how do you reconcile in a disaster environment when people are panicking and there's a lot of chaos going on, and everyone wants things done right now? How do you create that culture of being able to step back and take time?
Yeah, look, it was really hard. I would say we really struggled to do it in the first 3 weeks. Um, I guess the PMO tendency and our mindset of the staff and the team was we could see we were doing things that weren't effective, and that if we kept doing that on a daily basis, we'd run ourselves into the ground as well as everyone else. And so we were aware of, okay, the process isn't ideal. And the first day we had to get a report up in 8 hours. So we were running around literally that state emergency operations center, getting data verbally from people. Sometimes that data was changing every hour. And then we were going back plugging it in, communicating it, but often by the time we produced the report, the information had changed. And so, you know, I guess we just worked really hard as a team. Like we had to meet deadlines, so we just had to get things done. And then we just every day were like, okay, what can we do better? And we would just cherry pick one or two things that we could do better. It would often involve, you know, crazy hours, you know, of like reinventing things on the spot and then applying it and test and learn on the spot. So there wasn't a lot of time to actually sit down. But as a team, I guess we were checking in every 3 or 4 hours. Things were moving so rapidly, so in those check-ins things would change, and we'd just provide the opportunity for staff to share, okay, this is no longer working, this data source has dried up, or we need to take a different approach with this agency. And so we would just iterate together, implement, and then we just did that for a series of, you know, weeks before we were able to kind of breathe, and we had some of the reporting in the format we needed, and we had conversations already going. So at the same time this was happening, I just made sure we had critical conversations with key stakeholders who were our spatial services unit, who had all the expertise in a lot of the data management and collation. And we were able to get some of those satellite images. We just did things like alongside each other. So we were able to land the information as it was needed. And one really interesting thing, you know, from, you know, the difference between the bushfires and the floods, like the bushfires, the satellite images were made available quite quickly and readily. We had the burn scar, so you could actually see the impact from the burn scar quite quickly. For the floods, it was more challenging. There was a lot of guesswork in that flood mapping because it was cloudy. The satellite didn't have a clear view of over the, you know, the flood impact, and so by the time we got that view, the water had receded. So we had to work, you know, with federal recovery bodies and resilient bodies to help us kind of make a best estimate of what those impacts were. So look, there was just a lot of collaboration across agencies, which was fabulous, but a lot of, you know, intense design quite quickly and readily, and also to know that, you know, we didn't have it perfect. We've learnt now, and we've set up a process now for future dashboards and support that, and we are actually going to be pivoting to, okay, what happens if, you know, we're due now, we've had a series of flood events, we've had a series of rainy seasons now in Sydney, we're now due for another bushfire season. So we're now kind of thinking, okay, well, how do we get prepared for that now? We've done floods, how do we get prepared for bushfires, and what about other storm events or things that could happen? We need to kind of start thinking and preparing, so there's not so much work when we hit the event. We know what we need to do, and, you know, we know how we can respond.
That's great, thank you. And I think it touches on two more questions that have popped up in the chat. The one, obviously, as far as possible, we want to try and automate information to not have to go running around and trying to collate everything. So Michelle just asked whether you were able to automate those dashboards or whether it was mostly manual.
Yeah, fortunately we have. I think I would have gone grey by now if we were still doing that. No, we were able to automate it quite quickly and have those data sharing agreements. I think that was really interesting too, data sharing agreements between agencies and how to manage that data exchange, but also for other agencies who are measuring, like we had cleanup services, you've had quite a few number of agencies engaged in this, housing providers, emergency services. You know, how do we collect that information in an automated way, and, you know, how to ensure that there's that data security as well with that information coming through. So we were able to move to some automation already by week 3, and then, you know, a significant amount of the data has now been automated. There are still a few data sets, probably a handful of data sets that are plugged into a SharePoint site on a manual basis, but we're looking at that with those agencies into, you know, supporting and upskilling and making sure they've got that data capability. So yeah, we were able to pivot it to online quite quickly, and we've had 3 different versions of the dashboard. So we used the spatial services platform initially, and now we've moved to a Power BI, which is fantastic 1 year on, to have that information across all the events that we've been capturing data for, to be able to generate those insights.
Great, thank you. I think that touches or leads into maybe another question from Washington. He says Malawi's been hit by 4 cyclones in just the last 3 years, so that's, you know, quite intense. How has what you've done here now helped prepare you to be able to respond more effectively. So getting more data, getting those agency agreements. What other lessons are there that you could take out of this that they could potentially use in Malawi?
Yeah, yeah, and look, just touching on his question there, like impact the PMO's brought compared to the previous setup. Look, I think PMOs have a really valuable role to play, and I think especially in emergency kind of services organizations, and look, resilience was not the first responding agency. We were set up as a coordinating agency, so we were there for the recovery piece and the coordination piece. But there is, when you're in it, everyone's involved, and so I think having a PMO involved, and with that clarity that we still need to keep some of our projects ongoing and our portfolios that are priority for the organization, we were able to bring that to the table and make some decisions around that. That is empowering for staff to know, actually, no, I need to focus on delivering this priority project, even though all of this other event is happening and staff are mobilized. So that's really empowering for staff, but also for decision makers to be really clear on, we're making a decision to pause some of these projects because the focus is here and we need to dedicate resources and energy here. So that I think is what the PMO has brought this time round, and also that project discipline. Like setting up the dashboard was a massive project with 37 different agencies and stakeholders, and we were able to, the data engineering team are fabulous at data. They are incredible at insights, but they needed that support in terms of that stakeholder coordination. So we stepped in terms of that role, and were able to ensure that everyone was on the same page and set some milestones, set some timeframes, bring some agile methodology in to move this quite rapidly and quickly. And I think that's where the skill set of a PMO team can really help in this situation. But I guess my encouragement would be to don't lose sight. I think the temptation, and also sometimes leadership may not understand the role that the PMO can play, and don't and may lose sight in conflict or emergency situations about the ongoing project pieces and those strategic pieces that need to still happen in the agency. So just finding that balance, I think the PMO provides that.
Great, thank you. We have the time for a couple more questions, so if you do want to ask them, please put them into the chat. One of the, you talked about 37 different agencies having to coordinate all the data. My suspicion, knowing what I know coming from Africa, is that the level of sophistication in terms of data and so on is perhaps not quite the same. So if you do struggle to find data, or maybe an environment that hasn't really been geared up so as effectively, how would you go about trying to do what you do? Like, what simple steps could you recommend?
Yeah, so I think it's just firstly, I think being clear on the data that you need. I think if you've got a chance to think about that before the event, it will be, it'll be enormous help to just have clarity on, okay, if this hits us, this type of event hits us, what data do we need? From there, looking at, which agency or organization is best placed to provide that data. Then, approaching those organizations to understand, are they actually collecting that data? And it might be working with, if they're not, then working with them on finding a way on how they can do that, even if it's manual, even if it's a manual data collection for the moment. There's things that you can do now with Microsoft, SharePoint sites. So data could actually get uploaded manually into a SharePoint site that is shared with multiple providers, and they can go in and upload the data manually every day. So you can collect that data and actually feed that into a dashboard quite easily. But then also, that capacity building. So providing, if there's budget, if there's support, how do you support those organizations in collecting that data and setting up their own systems as well? And just being really clear too, because I think governments can do this, and governing bodies. You can think we need a vast amounts of data. Be really clear on what you actually need, and are you going to use that information to inform decisions? Is that information going to be helpful to people on the ground responding? Is that going to be information going to be helpful for community leaders? Is it going to be helpful for significant leaders in the the state or the nation needing to make decisions. So have a think about the level of data that's needed and how you're going to use that data for decision making is really important, because you just don't want to be collecting copious amounts of data either in this approach. So working that through. And I think, if you can do a lot of the preparedness work, I've heard a presentation from Istanbul last night, and they had already done some risk mapping. That risk mapping piece is really important, and understanding, I guess, where the communities are at, and have understanding on the well-being of those communities at that point in time. We used a measure that, for us, that we were able to, I guess, understood quite quickly that the communities up on the Northern Rivers, 75% of them were sitting in that kind of disadvantaged bracket, social economic bracket. And so, for this flood event to happen in that community, we're still dealing with the after effects of, housing supply and social challenges. That was really important, because that helped inform how do we respond to this, and how do we help support these communities in need. So, it's multi-pronged in terms of, understanding the resilience capacity of those communities currently, understanding what data set you need, and understanding, what decisions need to be made based on that data set.
All right. So I think at the end of the day, what I'm really hearing is, to respond well in a disaster, you actually need to have thought about it a lot ahead of time. It makes life a lot easier. So particularly if there are repeated floods, repeated bushfires, repeated cyclones, then there is actually a need for governments, for organizations to proactively plan what their disaster response recovery strategies would be, what sort of data is required, who's going to collect it, who needs to be funded, and how we build up a culture where we can step in very quickly and support people. Great. Well, I think it's been really useful, and we'll, in the panel discussion, we're going to dig into a little bit more some of the elements around preparation for disasters. So how do we respond in the early stages, but also how do we transition that into longer term ongoing support and preparation to simplify disaster recovery? So we'll take a short break now, and while we get the panel set up. While we're setting that up, if you haven't donated yet, please click the link, go and do your part and contribute to the relief efforts. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Sarah, very much, and I look forward to seeing you back in the panel in a few minutes' time.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you, everyone.